Right. I think we're live. So, first thing to remember is always be professional. I think that's what we've learned so far from this. Hey, everyone. Right, we got some attendees joining us. Awesome.
I should
Right, we'll
say
wait
you've
for.
you've
Oh,
you've set the bar high with the expected level of professionalism already. I'm not sure how I feel about that.
yeah, I should have just started with pro and
Yep.
we could go to professional afterwards. I- we could add just more Ls onto the end, like professional Ls, which as
The
people
prof
join will be super interesting.
the
Um,
professionalist.
we are. It's at 5 p.m. as well, which for us after a long day, it's hey, that's why we are pros. Hey everyone, as you're joining in, we're just waiting for some attendees to join us, so we'll get started in just a minute whilst we start talking about how professional we are. Um, I'm so professional, I'm wearing my company's t-shirt for a webinar, which is that's the level of professional, and I see you've got your hoodie on.
I have the branded hoodie on. This hoodie is way too warm, but we're going to persist.
It's new building regulations and hoodies. Like, yeah, I'm
Lewis,
cozy.
you and I have spoken about my house before. You know that my house is not a warm one.
Yeah, and my house used to not be a warm one, and now it is quite warm. And it's lovely. Like, yeah, you're always more than welcome if you ever pop down to Cardiff. Always more than welcome to join.
I'll take you up on that sometime.
All right. A couple more attendees have joined. I think we'll get started now. And if for people joining in the future, I hope it's a bright and lovely place. Hey everyone, it's Lewis Denham-Parry here from Edera, and welcome to our Rumble series. And it's my absolute distinct, another professional word, pleasure to introduce you to Iain Smart. Iain, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. Hello, I'm Ian. I'm a principal consultant at Amberwolf, an offensive security specialist company in the UK. I have about 10 years of background as a professional penetration tester, the last 8 of which probably have been spent working in DevSecOps, cloud, and most recently Kubernetes and CI/CD environments.
Cool. And yeah, we vaguely know each other. Like there's some things that we've worked on together, like KCD UK. So we recently had the Edinburgh conference. We're about to go to Manchester together to go present talks together. And also we used to work at a company, but not at the same time, I believe.
I don't think we ever crossed paths at the same time. We did know each other through uni, which is concerning to remember.
Oh yeah. Um,
That goes back
but
quite a while.
yes, it does. Gee whiz. And the other one as well was we both uh, we both helped run the CTF at KubeCon. Did you have any favorite scenarios that you ran?
I really liked my chatbot that wasn't actually a chatbot, just because I got to see people get extremely angry when they realized that the chatbot they were trying to do clever prompt injection attacks against was 80 lines of Go, 26 of which were a random list of responses that it was choosing to return.
So, and that's definitely not the same case now, is it? Like it's all the industry's completely changed now, and it's not the
I mean,
same
I've
about it.
I've seen some AI products that I reckon are pretty much the same, but maybe slightly more advanced.
And well, on that basis, it was KubeCon Atlanta last week, and so that's where we used to run the CTFs as well as the European version of KubeCon. But last week it was amazing. I went out there early to go to Rejects, and still there's such a strong community at Rejects, and it's friendly faces, but we're still seeing the industry push forward, and not just with AI, I would say, but we're also seeing other parts after like the significant 10 years of Kubernetes. Then we have maintainer days, and there's an interesting part of maintain. Well, it happened later in the conference, but Ingress Nginx. So have you seen the news about Ingress Nginx, Ian?
Yeah, I've not read all the details, but I think there's some deprecation warnings coming up for the around this time, early next year.
Yeah. And so I think it's in March. I think it's they've given notice, and there's we can share some resources actually because there's some other webinars from other people. James Strong from iSurveillance, I saw that he's going to be in one. I believe, on the 6th, but we can share those in follow-up notes. But it's an interesting time within the industry because we're seeing maintainers as well as like these projects that we're dependent on are also starting to move on. And so it's going to be interesting just to see as a community what happens next there. Then we had Open Source Security Con. I believe that's the right name for it. It keeps changing. It's either my mind keeps changing or the name keeps changing. I don't know which one it is, but that's where we've been previously with that CTF, as well as the main KubeCon. And there was some really great parts there. Also, Marina Moore, who works at Edera, she chairs that, and she also won a Taggy Award, which was great to see her on the front stage. And then all week at KubeCon, we just on. Well, I stayed on the booth predominantly, and there's lots of conversations around this topic that we're about to talk today about multi-tenancy, which um, I was really interested because lots of people are saying that they're using namespaces for isolation. And Ian, do you have opinions on that?
I have very strong opinions on the use of namespaces for isolation. First of all, the fact that namespaces is such a horribly overloaded term, because do we mean container runtime namespaces? Do we mean Linux namespaces? Do we mean Kubernetes namespaces? But yes, as will become clear over the next while, I have opinions.
So we'll fall back on naming is hard. So calling namespaces is yes. We're going to start from that point, but we'll definitely go further into this topic so that over the next 30 to 60 minutes, depending on how in which pedestals we stand on or rabbit holes we go down, we'll see where we get to. But for me, I think probably just bringing it down to what is multi-tenancy as a starting point, because multi-tenancy as well it's one of those things that the idea in my mind, it might be completely different to yours, but for me, multi-tenancy, it isn't just about people, it's about workloads, it's about utilizing a single resource to do lots of different things. And this resource in this context for me is Kubernetes. It's a case of using a cluster to do multiple different jobs. Now, the reason I say that is because I came from a developer background, and I remember when I used to run monoliths, which at the time were the bane of my life, but equally, I probably look fondly just thinking, wow, that was such a simple way to build things. But now we have microservices. Each microservice would have its own identity. It requires to do a different thing. And the way that we spread this out, so we might have a website, and that website can connect onto our internal API, but then only those two should be able to communicate to each other. That API can connect onto a worker process that can connect to a database, each with separate identities, but multi-tenant in that aspect. Because the clear one to me as well is just having multiple customers utilizing your system and having their data stored as well, which could also be a multi-tenant because you've got separate identities there. But Ian, is there a better way that you think of this as well?
Not really, because there's so many definitions for this. I think you're quite right there. So multi-tenancy in Kubernetes, we've seen be everything from a single cluster hosting a single web application, which enforces the multi-tenancy there. So everything's in one database, everything's in one web endpoint, but the customers are separated by the permissions within the app. We've also seen multiple instances of the same application being run for multiple tenants, just to keep things somewhat more separate than trusting on just application controls. And then we get the slightly more interesting cases where you've got multiple users directly using Kubernetes through its APIs rather than through the workloads it runs. So the first two examples were kind of, I've got lots of customers using the things that come out of my Kubernetes cluster. So your hosted web applications, your microservices, and so on. But we also see teams where they don't want to be paying for multiple Kubernetes clusters. So each development team will have access to the same cluster. So your finance teams, your IT teams, or your individual project teams will have access to the same cluster, and they're separated through various different options. We also see customers try to use this for separation of development and production environments. I would say if anyone's listening now and runs dev and prod in the same cluster, please reconsider what you're doing for reasons we'll see later. That's probably my least favorite of these to see. And what we can see is when it's multi-tenancy that is just in application or multiple apps, but no users using the Kubernetes API, things tend to be okay, but can go a little bit badly. When we perform engagements against clusters where there are multiple development teams all accessing Kubernetes as Kubernetes users, things start to get a little bit more messy. And then there's also the difference between hard and soft multi-tenancy, which I don't know if they're recognized terms, but for the audience here, I consider something to be soft multi-tenancy if it's we trust all of these people to know that all these tenants to know each other exists and be fairly nice to each other. So an internal development platform where everybody knows that this is for internal dev use and there's other users. And then hard multi-tenancy is actually we've got people coexisting in the same cluster who must not know that the other exists, never mind any risk of interaction between them.
Yeah. And again, it's another dimension, isn't it, when we start thinking of it in that manner, because it's a case of the different layers that we have and what people have access to on that multi-tenant cluster, it can become confusing. It can become difficult because again, from those aspects, it's a case of we're running workloads on our clusters because it's back to business at the end of the day. That's like our portal as a way to generate revenue and money. And if something goes down, sometimes we need to break glass and go and debug on the fly and so forth. But in doing that, in breaking those glass moments, then it's equally, are you giving people keys to be able to look around elsewhere? And yeah, and it's kind of terrifying in ways, but maybe let's move on to Kubernetes a little bit as well, because hard and soft as well. I think of that with Kubernetes, with taints and tolerations. A basis of having a soft toleration to say that I want to be running on a node. I want to be running in a node within the UK data region because we're based in the UK and not for those reasons. I just want to have a data center close to me. But it could be a soft toleration because if all those data centers went offline, then it's I'm okay for this data to then go past another place, such as France. But if we're going to back to the laws and such, then I might have a hard toleration that it has to stay in the UK, that we can't actually have data go outside of UK boundary. And let's use hardware as an example as well. If I got a workload that requires a GPU and a node doesn't have a GPU, then I'm also going to have a hard toleration there. So we do see those concepts of hard and soft, which we'll probably work more on as we go through this webinar, focusing more on multi-tenancy. The thing that I'd also like to start with, so again, I've been using Kubernetes for quite some time now. Um, Citation needed. And I started off by giving lots of training of Kubernetes. And it was back in the day of people going from VMs to containers and then orchestrating their containers. And the problem that I said that Kubernetes solved was the scale, running containers at scale. And it was solving a problem that if we have a single box, if we have a single server and we're running our containers on there and that server goes down, then everything goes down. Whereas with Kubernetes, we can start having multiple servers available to us and then we can run at scale. Now, the next part was also talking about Tetris, because the way that we use Kubernetes is a case of getting as much bang for our buck by trying to put our workloads together. So it's a case of if I'm spending this amount of money on this machine, then I want to make sure that I'm utilizing as much of those resources as possible. That was back when I got started with Kubernetes, and that was the problems it was solving. But now that we're talking about multi-tenancy, I see a clear problem here, Ian, about actually, if I'm running workloads on the same machine, and equally, if I'm running workloads, as you've mentioned, like multi-tenant workloads on this cluster with this network, does that cause problems? So, what's your perspective of that?
Yeah, definitely. The cost benefits of I've got all of this hardware and I want to use 85, 90% of it rather than 10% of it is way better because you paid all this money for your hardware. Of course, you want to make the best use of it. Again, security has always been a trade-off of well, security and usability. And I think if you add cost into that equation as well, things start to get even more messy. The mention of taints and tolerations as a mechanism as a security boundary is an interesting one, because I would argue that if you have the ability to create workloads yourself, now again, there's a distinction between people using workloads which are already created by the platform admins versus people creating workloads in the cluster yourselves. If you've got the ability to create a workload in a cluster, you can completely bypass all taints and tolerations, and you can actually force your workload onto a specific node even if you shouldn't be able to normally. Because taints and tolerations are advice to the scheduler in Kubernetes. So if you create a pod that has a node name pre-populated, you just say, I would like this pod, and as part of the spec that I give you, your node is Lewis's private node that no one else should have access to. The scheduler won't get involved at all. So Kubernetes will just happily go, right, the kubelet on a node will just go, oh, that node's mine, that pod's mine, sorry, I'll just spin up that workload, which is very much fun to see when customers think that a taint is a security boundary. And there are other bits as well, like various options. As soon as you get multiple people trying to use the same platform, you need to give those users a level of permission. And Kubernetes is full of sharp edges and things that don't necessarily restrict and separate their users as well as a lot of admins think they do.
You've mentioned two words there, security boundary. And
Yes.
as an end user of Kubernetes, it's that meme, and again, we'll probably share it with person with a butterfly saying, is this a security boundary? Each time we see Kubernetes, and it's a case of, are we perceiving this to be a security boundary? Is this like when we learn about pods, and it's a case of, well, the pods, if you've got containers that need to communicate with each other and work together, then you put them in a pod together. Is that a security boundary? When we have this concept of namespaces, where it's a case of these workloads here, like you mentioned, dev and prod. So we've got a dev namespace here. Is that a security boundary? And spoilers, it isn't. And we'll go deeper into why.
Well,
But
you
well,
say
I'll
it
let you.
isn't. Apologies to cut you off there, but you say it isn't. I would argue that your security boundaries are wherever you say they are. So everyone will have their own opinions. AWS claim that a Kubernetes namespace is not a security boundary, and that's
Hmm.
a perfectly valid viewpoint. But I've worked with customers who absolutely view them as a security boundary, and they've architected their entire security, their platform building, their monitoring, their detection and response around the fact that a namespace is a security boundary. So while it may not be the best one, you can build something using whatever you would like to be as your security boundary as long as you build the processes and the structures to support that.
Which brings, I would say that brings up a great discussion about threat modeling then as well, because
Oh, absolutely.
basic. And so threat modeling is essentially a basis of looking at the position that you're in. So at the moment we're on a webinar. My threat is that if Ian's monitors stop working or the internet goes down, then it's just going to be myself on the webinar. Is that a risk I'm willing to take? Well, yes, today because we're going to be fine. And yesterday on the internet, incidentally, there was no Cloudflare outage whatsoever. So everything is going to go perfectly fine. Um,
Did anyone else get messages from their parents saying you've broken our Wi-Fi again? Why is it not working? When it was actually a global outage that took down most of the internet? Because I definitely got one of them.
I think what we can see is that you're a better child to your parent. My parents don't look to me for that. Um, I do get them coffee, that's it. So the threat modeling basis is that, well, it's okay for this org. And to your point there, you went into quite some detail as well as to what the mitigations they're putting in place. And even though they're putting in place, there could still be a risk to them, but they believe that risk to be worth it. And another example that springs to mind, it was in the hallway track at KubeCon, and I will. The information was already redacted, but there was a bank, and someone was mentioning their experience within a bank where they were trying to go as fast as they could, and they did one thing that caused them to have a fine. And actually, for them to get to market as quickly as they could, it was worth the fine because for them, it was part of their threat model. It was a case of, well, actually, this allows us to get the business, and that's okay at this moment. Now, as a consumer, I might feel differently, but that wasn't my decision. And equally, that was on the hallway track, and that's what I overheard. But I do feel those discussions and decisions that are happening elsewhere. At that point as well, I'd like to relate back to a panel that was at KubeCon. It was hosted by Adrian Moet, a good friend of ours, also an organizer and of KCD UK. And on the panel was Alexander as well. Um, Now, in that panel, there's Adrian raised a question of developer freedom or security. One word answers go. Now, to my friend Adrian, there can only be one answer of security in that instance because that's the only one word answer available. But Ian, you were mentioning earlier on about like developer, like given that freedom, that flexibility to be able to do things as well. And then we usually say that security follows that as well. And I'm guessing you see that a lot within your pen test work. But how do you feel about developer freedom and security in that context?
Yeah, I've definitely worked with customers who are going through various stages of growth as they come out of startup and either look to get acquired or become more regulated. And the loss of freedom is the thing that hits them most. Now, that could be in their development environment, that could be in adding security to the laptops they run, being told they're not allowed to run a certain operating system anymore because it's not compliant. I, I wish I had a great answer for this. It's really, really hard. Um, it's such a difficult space to be in. I think the best kind of guardrails you can put in are making sure you've got some kind of detection and monitoring and some kind of auditing on what your developers are doing before you start restricting. So that, yes, we all know developer environments are less secure than production, although arguably they should be just as secure because they're the things that feed into production. And recent
Mhm.
supply chain attacks definitely echo that. Um, I think if you're very aware that you're susceptible to some kind of supply chain attack into your developers' systems, having something like an internal registry that allows you to keep track of what you've been running and what artifacts you've been pulling from the internet so that if something does get compromised, you've got something you can do forensics on is a very good start for people who are looking at improving their developer security. Also, just be aware that you're going to annoy a lot of developers when you start to restrict what they've got available. It's just going to happen.
Yeah. And so we've yet to mention the elephant in the room being AI. I think no, you started off by saying you've written it. You created AI, if I
I,
remember
I
rightly,
wrote a
with
one. I am the father of AI, and that chatbot is infallible.
well, it is actually in the middle of your name. So there we go. So, and you are smart as we can attest. So good, we're fine.
Hey,
Hey, got it. Finally got that joke in.
I
Um,
wondered when that was coming.
yeah, it'll probably come back again in a moment. But because with AI at the moment and seeing AI agents, and I see a lot of negativity towards it. I wrote something called Ivy Bot. Well, it's Ivy Sketch, and it was my deep dive into AI at different levels, done with LLMs, looking at RAGs, looking at MCPs, and the agent. Ultimately, my belief here is actually we need to put secure environments in place for AI agents to run and work. If we start restricting access to aspects of a system because of threats, they can't be as performant as they necessarily would because essentially it's been lots of guardrails in place that can prevent them going off to do good jobs. Now, I understand that the other side is dropping production databases, which was like I don't know if it was a meme or news like 2 months ago, but I don't, I'm not suggesting that we let AI drop our databases, but the point here, it isn't even AI. This is going back to developer. This is going back to users of writing code. It's a basis of we need to set people up for success. And to do that, if we restrict all the tools and what they can and can't do, that's going to restrict the momentum that they can have. And the reason I'm saying this so much is that I do really see a position where Edera can help. We'll go into it further about virtualization and isolation in a moment, but I see that Edera can give this playground where you can go into an environment and you know that it's safe and secure and performant to allow for this flexibility to continue. Well, maybe I'll jump into that then, because actually, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, Ian. So you've been on my mind all week after KubeCon thinking about this
What's new?
webinar. It's I know it's the start of every week. I think, what's going to happen with Ian this week? And usually it's like, as long please don't like try to pen test my house that looks like a small business, but that's another thing for another day. And yes, but virtualization and versus isolation. So I believe we shared the link in the chat as well. So I wrote a post, and part of the post was inspired by a post that you gave about Kubernetes isolation, and another one was it was from a Kubernetes namespaces and using that as a back to this boundary, it's a security boundary, which I didn't agree with, and so I shared my point. Thinking more about it and to help understand better about the problem that we have here, I'm going to VR, so virtual reality. So it's a basis of I can sit in my lounge at home and I can put a headset on and I can believe that I'm driving a car in Italy and it almost feels real. It's crazy how real it can feel until I take that headset off and I realize that I'm in the lounge in my house. Now, that's for me, it's kind of like virtualization. It's taking me in my current environment and making me feel like I'm somewhere else, and I can't really see what's around me and so forth. Now, isolation is the inverse of that in my mind. And I'm still trying to work on this, but it's a case of if I was in a car and I had a virtual headset on, thinking that I was in my lounge, and I take it off, but I'm actually in production on the road, all of a sudden in the environment that I'm in, I'm a little bit more concerned about because I'm not in that safety of my house. I'm on the road. I don't know, am I driving the car? Is someone else driving the car? What car am I in? What road am I on? All these things start to make me all of a sudden feel a lot more nervous with that virtual reality headset because I'm not isolated in a safe space. The reason I'm saying this is because I feel like when we run our workloads today, we're very focused on what we're running in our containers, in our pods, in our namespaces, but I don't feel we're necessarily as concerned about what we're running next to. The processes are beside us. And we don't really have the ability, unless you've got someone as good as yourself to be able to pen test and break out of these things, to look around. But the problem is that if someone does break out and look around, someone can see that I'm sat there with my VR headset on, and they can see everything that I'm doing, which isn't necessarily a good position for me. So I feel that we need to really focus on when we talk about virtualization and isolation, to really be clear, virtualization came from VMs in my mind and containers, and that's why we talk about them today in cloud native. But it's weird that you can kind of see a kernel in a container when it doesn't exist. Like it's those things that we've kind of inherited, but we had to inherit to have that virtualization feel. And now we really need to focus on the isolation because if you get host of a box that's running multiple containers, just run psfo and you can see all the processes of all the containers and then you can see everything in there. But does that analogy work for you? I've held out so long on an analogy on Arcolian, but or can I improve this in any way?
I I get what you're going at, and my brain hurts at the same time, which is very typical for when Lewis shares an analogy. Yeah, I think using the container runtime as a VR headset to change your view is fairly accurate through the use of not the namespaces we're here to talk about, but the kind of Linux namespacing if you're using something like run C and containerd, or if you're doing something that's a harder boundary like Edera, changing what's visible does make sense. I think the key point that we'd all like to make, and this is where my approach to workload isolation somewhat differs from the problems that Edera is solving, is that the VR headset is covering the eyes and the ears in this scenario. But the other bits that I see go wrong are the fact that even with a headset on, you can still reach your arms around and interact with other things in the area. And this is where I'm really going to strain your analogy, I'm afraid. But if you're saying, okay, we've got perfect isolation because we have this amazing VR headset that means the person in the headset does not know Matrix style that they are in the Matrix in the VR, they may still be able to make network requests or make use of secrets or credentials or Kubernetes RBAC, and the main thing that we've been discussing in the run up to this. So you can get around the headset by, you know, sticking your arm out the window and seeing what you can grab hold of, sort of thing. So there's definitely the isolation has so many different ways it manifests when it comes to security and keeping workloads separated from each other.
Yeah, definitely. And so for context various, back to the two sides of our story, and that's why this webinar is super interesting for me. When it comes to Edera, we're focusing on the workload. We're focusing on that runtime. We're focusing on when we unpack a container image, how do we run those processes to provide that level of isolation on the workload itself so that you can run a workload on a machine and have that absolutely isolated from another workload. When we're talking about and the multi-tenancy aspect and the isolation from you, Iain, is well, all of this has to run on the network. All these things have to be able to communicate to each other as well. There's multiple identities running within this cluster that we also need can do lots of different things. And so, yeah. So let's talk about RBAC then. So should my RBAC just be stars?
Your RBAC, as Ian Coldwater said once, we're all made of stars, but your RBAC absolutely should not be. I have that on stickers on just about every device I own. They are wonderful. Yeah, there are so many ways that RBAC can go wrong, and I think a lot of customers we speak to are not locking down Kubernetes environments and getting the basics correct. So once you get to the level that Edera provides extra protection, so you're talking about we no longer are interacting against a shared kernel, we're not worried about things on the same host being able to see each other. I think that's about 4 levels lower than a lot of organizations are still struggling with, which is a really interesting thing to see because you're almost working from the hardware and the operating system up, whereas I'm looking at things from the API level down. Especially when you look at things like the cloud. The most impactful kind of multi-tenancy thing that we've been having success with lately, and I've seen a few people talking about this on LinkedIn, is in Kubernetes environments and specifically EKS. So this is something that would work elsewhere, but we've seen it in AWS clusters before, where you've got access to things like the AWS metadata service, which I think people know you probably shouldn't let your workloads access, but they're certainly not always isolated as well as they should be. If you can get access to the metadata service from a Kubernetes pod through something like a server-side request forgery in a web application. So that's when you say you've got a website that's trying to retrieve an image from a location, but it allows the user to say the location they want it to come from. So you're meant to say, get the image from myphotos.com/cat.gif. And I say, actually, I want this server to go and get a photo from 169.254.169.254, which is the AWS metadata service. Suddenly, instead of seeing a picture of a cat, I might be seeing the credentials that let me log into AWS and pretend to be that machine. That can then let you authenticate throughout different components in Kubernetes and actually be able to create service account tokens through Kubernetes identity in a way that has nothing to do with breaking out on the physical node itself. You're just taking advantage of a shared network space and the ability to talk to a shared endpoint with a shared identity. And then we kind of see the same with just service account tokens in RBAC, where you can have your pod run as a certain user and that user has certain permissions. So this might be a workload that's running, it might be your CI/CD platform, it might be the credentials you give to your developers. A lot of the time we see that organizations give access to a single namespace, but they'll happily give out admin in that namespace and you can do, whatever you want, but only in this logical namespace that says this is Lewis's space and Lewis is only allowed to interact within this, within this section of the cluster. And anything that's deemed to be critical to security is a wider, it's more locked down, sorry, it's only accessible to administrators and Lewis can't interact with them or Iain can't interact with them. And that's probably the number one way that I've been compromising clusters lately is overly permissive RBAC, which is just, an admin has given something more permissions than they thought they had.
And maybe at this point as well, we should just state as well that when you do this in people's clusters, you have their consent first as well, don't you?
Oh, I should,
It's
yes, all of these engagements have either been part of an authorized penetration test, which we do as a day job, or as part of a capture the flag event when it's an authorized thing that you're allowed to go and test for learning or for fun. Anyone listening who thinks I'm going to go and hack all the things, please don't go and just hack all the things on the internet without permission. That's a terrible idea.
yeah, yeah. Um, so with our background and role-based access control, and to all those points, are there any tools that I could use today within my Kubernetes cluster that can help me get started to understand would I be impacted by this or affected it?
There are. I think there's lots of tools out there which review your RBAC for you to some extent. Kubernetes has a built-in kubectl auth cani dash dash list. So if you ever want to know what a single entity can do, find a way of running as that user or that pod or something. If you're ever doing a CTF in Kubernetes, auth cani dash dash list will show you the breadcrumbs that every challenge setter has wanted to give you because there's always a path there that's visible. There's lots of other tooling as well. There's a tool called kubectl who can, which has not been maintained for a long time. I believe that one came out of Aqua Security. I could be wrong. That gives you say who can create a pod, and it will tell you everybody who's able to do so. There are a number of other tools. There's one from CyberArk for RBAC review. They're all outdated now. And I think everybody I've spoken to who says this has the same opinion of everybody wants all of the tools to be maintained better. So everybody is writing their own tool to do the same thing. So it's the good old XKCD of 16 competing standards, and now we've got 17 because we made a new one to unify all the standards.
I believe it's 18 now, but
Is it
yes,
18? Are we up at 18? I've lost track.
we're up at 8. Yeah, and an interesting point there is because so essentially what we've been speaking about so far is lateral movement as well. It's a case of starting from a position where you couldn't do much, but then finding this metadata service and utilizing the tools available to go out and change and then get credentials to do something else. That's what we'd call lateral movement. Am I right here?
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't even have to be credentials. Lateral movement is just a step in an attack chain of going, I have found myself in a position, I want to get somewhere else. And in a Kubernetes attack chain, that could be from finding credentials and going elsewhere. It could be from breaking out of a workload to compromise the host. It could be various other options. But yeah, it's moving from where we've landed in a system to somewhere else.
And because part of that where you finished there about spinning up a pod as well. So because you go from a position where you shouldn't be able to do that, and now you're able to do that via what you've found. And thank you for sharing as well. Um, it's remote code execution as a service. Well, sorry, remote code execution first, not as a service. That's something else entirely. Remote code execution, or RICE, RCE. Um, that's a bit of a concern as well because it's a case of bringing workloads into your estate that allow further leverage. And I would just say that, like, back from an Edera standpoint as well, we see a use case for what we do in that if you can't trust this workload on that level, then running it within there, it does prevent you from hitting those nodes. Now, to your point there with that metadata attack, well, that's part of a network. And so, like, again, those things are very difficult to manage. But the reason why I was really excited for having you on this webinar is because Kubernetes is massive. Um, I saw a video from Kelsey Hightower, and Kelsey was asked, what's your favorite feature of Kubernetes?" And it was CRDs, because CRDs, like custom resource definitions, allow you to expand Kubernetes to do lots more things and everything else. And the follow-up question was, "What's your least favorite feature of Kubernetes?" And he said, KRDs, custom resource definitions, because they allow you to expand and do everything else. And back to your point just then about saying that there's 17, now 18 different ways to do things. It's that again. And so we're bringing in, it's a constantly evolving landscape. Almost terrifying because it's a case of with your CRD, how do we manage that? But have you seen much with CRDs from your standpoint?
I've not seen much in the way of customers building their own CRDs. What I have seen is an awful lot of installing an operator or installing some software which brings its own CRDs because it needs to supplement what Kubernetes does natively. So things like Cilium bringing in its own Cilium network policy to supplement the basic Kubernetes network policy example. So every cluster I've seen is using them to some extent. I've not seen many customers who've written something truly entirely custom.
Cool. So we talked a little bit about identity. I feel in a way, and I wanted to touch on identity with multi-tenancy because, well, we talked about some identities already. Like when we talked about all stars within your RBAC, that's cluster admin in my mind in that. And for context as well, stars within your RBAC, it's it's like having 5 stars on a McDonald's label. It's like you can go anywhere in that McDonald's and you can do whatever you want because you're a pro. Um, see, sorry, Zoom just decided to go straight up in my screen there. Um, Now, and we want to restrict that access on that identity because equally, I don't want to be cluster admin because I don't want to, I don't want to have all that responsibility. But identity inside of our cluster as well is based on our workload. So it's a case of if I have a container running within my pod, then it can have its own identity that allows it to connect onto specific things. So do you, I guess this is continuing in from your previous attack. What do you see from identities from your pen testing standpoint? Do you see lots of people managing identities well? Do you see there's a solution to this? Is there a project that you'd recommend in that context?
I'm deliberately going to avoid that. Is there anything I would recommend? Because
Okay.
everything is so very subjective. You will find something that works for you, and if you don't, you will build your own. And if I recommend something now, in 8 months' time, when there's a weird edge case that doesn't do what you need, but you've committed your whole company to using it, you'll be cursing my name. So I will avoid that problem for now.
So
Um,
you've had that experience on the internet, have you?
oh, once or twice. I say something on the internet, and everything that goes wrong is my fault. Yes,
From your parents specifically as well. But anyway, please continue.
indeed. Um, we've seen identity responses being used, and we've seen so many things to do with identity that have gone well and so many that haven't. Um, one of the hardest targets we went up against in a Kubernetes DevSecOps space was doing their secrets manager was tying into their CI pipelines so that only a secret stored in the manager was only accessible to a certain CI job triggered by people in the correct Active Directory groups based on the correct GitHub branches as long as all of the commits were signed. And identity was all automatically not required. Nobody had to do anything because it was all baked into their platform itself. And we've also seen the opposite of that, which is we're just going to hard code the admin keys into everything so that everything runs as a this case, it was literally just a hard-coded string, which was shared to everything and everyone, which was less effective for enforcing those security boundaries we spoke about earlier.
So my audio cut out for a little bit there, and I just caught the end. So I'm going to go back to recording and I'll catch back up.
What I said was brilliant and perfect, no notes required.
Never in doubt. Yeah, so and from identity, I'm also so we'll probably do another we'll do whatever it is that we're doing right now for another couple of minutes and then we'll go to some of the questions. Now with identity, the reason I say that is because actually when we got identities, it's starting to put things in place, but there's this concept of zero trust as well, which I love, and I mentioned it to you earlier this morning, and I can't remember the DM that you sent me, and I don't know if it's as expletive as my t-shirt is right now. But so what are your thoughts on zero trust within multi-tenancy again?
Yeah, zero trust is hard, I think, is probably it's a buzzword that's been going around lately. And zero trust, if you look at some of the work that some of my colleagues in Amberwolf have been doing lately, isn't as successful as people seem to want it to be. I think the key point, and the NCSC in the UK recently updated their guidance to say something along these lines, is that zero trust is not a product that you can buy. It's a mindset, and you need to build out everything to support um, your zero trust approach. So zero trust as a concept is basically saying we're not going to care too much about where someone is. You know, we're not going to. Historically, there was an implicit trust of if you're in an office, say, you're allowed to access all of the resources that that company has because you're in a privileged, physical position. Or if you're running a certain device type, then you're trusted just because that's what that organization tends to run. Zero Trust is saying, actually, no, we're not going to just implicitly give anybody access to anything because of where they are or how they're connected. We need to provide identity, we need to provide logic and rules around all of the access with all of these restrictions that make Zero Trust much harder to maintain at scale, even though it is far more effective than I hope people on this call know that just blindly accepting that people can access a site just based on a location without having to sign in is not going to always be a good idea. There's an
So,
argument that Kubernetes is zero trust by default. There's a lot of, oh, it's got MTLS, so everything is zero trust, or all of the components are talking to each other. That kind of holds up if all you consider is just the Kubernetes base before you start to add on any workloads or any of the CRDs that we were talking about earlier.
and well, it's so zero trust. I once heard a previous colleague was working at Google, and it was I was asking them a couple of years ago, and it's a case of, well, do you trust like internet traffic? Is VPNs the correct route? And they said no. They said that there shouldn't be a VPN that you connect into. And I'm not suggesting the VPNs that people use on their mobile phones to be able to say that they're in America to watch something in America. This in this context, it's about within business. It's a case of should you be able to connect home? This was back during 2000 when we all had to work remotely all of a sudden, and then people were trying to quickly latch on. But their advice was that actually HTTPS, that should be what you use because it's back to your point there. It's a case of we're not seeing it being able to purchase zero trust, but it's more of a mindset. It's more of a you're dependent on your people within your organization. That's that's a boundary that we're looking at there. And well, linking it back to Edera because that's what I do. When we when we bring in things that have been developed outside of our estate, outside of our building, we need to put it into a place where we can trust that that workload can run, and we want to make sure that it can't escape essentially. And you've mentioned ways in Kubernetes that we can get different leverages and so forth, and yeah, we have those cases. But also, I've seen instances where it's a case of like we've CVEs we've talked about, and when they're not disclosed, and when various ways to be able to break out of those workloads. I've compared it to kind of like a grenade in a box. It's a case of like, and as an attacker, not suggesting you're an attacker, as someone, sorry, and I shouldn't use the term attacker, as in a Red Hat engagement, apologies for saying that. You're not necessarily just like going, I'm just going to do this one thing and I'm just going to break out here. I'm going to try literally everything and just go for everything because I just want to get my next foothold. That's where I see Edera helping us, especially with our workloads at that runtime to be able to reduce that blast radius so that you can only see what's in that zone. And it's for me, it's what I used to think containers were back in the day when I first got started until I learned from the CTFs that we worked and created on that actually processes are just running side by side at this moment in time. You just got to look out far away enough. So moving off from that, we'll go into one more topic and then we'll go into questions. But the most exciting one is compliance and auditing. Um, like that is the firework of this webinar is compliance and auditing. And I shouldn't jest as much as I do because it is still a huge requirement of what we're looking at. If you join in the call today, it's a basis of the industry that you work in might not require certain levels and so forth. But I would say that we're all a consumer of this. We all have our information that we want stored somewhere safe. I'm thinking right now about personal identifiable information. I'm thinking about healthcare. I'm thinking about government and so forth, like that and like tax codes, my accounting, my banking. Those things are super important to me. And I also don't want anyone else to know these things for reasons. But equally, it's like I want to know that they're safe. I want to know that no one is malicious coming into these things. And so we see with compliance that to be able to get workloads in with Kubernetes into these environments, we've got to go through certain processes. We've got to adhere. So if we've got a product, we might have to do SOC 2 compliance. If you're looking to go into a highly privileged estate, you have to go through FedRAMP. Now, the tools that we have today, and specifically Kubernetes and multi-tenancy, that is achievable. But it's you have to try harder. You have to have these in place. And then, so I'm interested from your pen test experiences, and I feel like it's more towards auditing. Like, what role do you play in these environments? So, me as an end user to my healthcare system, how are you helping me as a consumer within those environments?
Yeah, so an awful lot of our engagements are compliance driven. So it's customers who have a requirement to demonstrate that they have had a security review to some extent. So most of what we are doing at Amberwolf is security advisory, and that's either doing a pen test so that you can provide your auditors with, yes, we have had a pen test, here are the results. If there were any findings, here's demonstrating how we're fixing them. Equally, a lot of it is we're just trying to help organizations where they maybe don't fully understand what they're running or haven't looked at things with a security viewpoint. So specifically with Kubernetes, like I am not a great sysadmin who can keep a Kubernetes cluster running for years on end and handling however much data actually needs to flow through it. What I'm very good at doing is looking at a system that someone has built to process sensitive information and saying, if I press that button there, then things fall over and suddenly I can get access to the system behind the scenes and get access to the data directly. The compliance and auditing around Kubernetes conversation is huge, and I realize that this could go beyond Kubernetes as well. Um, Having any kind of logs is difficult because there's so many components in a cluster that have their own log sources. There are so many sources of identity that you need to keep track of. Until recently, Kubernetes didn't actually log the credential type that was used for individual components. So if you logged in with a service account token versus a client certificate, all that would be shown was the username, so you could easily spoof and pretend to be another user. That was fixed, I believe, a couple of years ago now, but until recently wasn't the case. Yeah, auditing something as complicated as this is difficult, especially when dealing with auditors who may not be as familiar with the technologies that you've worked with as well. So sometimes we'll see customers who've demonstrated a technical control to an auditor, and the auditor has just not understood either the problem that they're to check about or how the solution actually solves a problem because it's different to what they previously saw. So organizations might be audited on, what's your minimum password length? And you could say, well, we're totally passwordless. We run only passkeys. But suddenly you can't tick the box that says, oh, my minimum password length is 12 because you don't run password. You don't use passwords.
Hmm.
And I think, yes, as the pace of Kubernetes and similar technologies is so rapid, it's a struggle to keep on track of all the requirements.
And it's an interesting time with Kubernetes on that base. And again, KubeCon was a prime example of it in that like lots of people are saying it's 10 years old, which might be saying it on the level of maturity of Kubernetes, of the ecosystem. But a lot of the attendees that I've met at Atlanta last week, they're still getting started. There's like sometime for a number of people, this is their first KubeCon. They've just started using Kubernetes. Either either they're just getting started building their own cluster, they're inheriting another cluster, and it's just and that's where it comes back down to these parts, which even though for both of us now, because we've been here for quite a while, and there were other conversations focusing on AI, and it's like, how are we solving AI within a Kubernetes cluster? How are we bringing that in? And there's lots of talk there, but we still see people at the start. So back to end users, it's we got people who are doing the things that we had to learn 10 years ago. And so it's interesting, how are we going to build, and maybe webinars like this is starting to bring up that discussion and also sharing these tool sets. But equally, as we see with the ecosystem, like that's where the Edera product came from. It was a sort of problem that I thought was previously solved when I first got started with a cluster, and then I later learned it wasn't. And yeah, and we'll go into the questions now as well. But just before we do, because we spoke a lot about security, and security used to absolutely terrify me, to the point where I stayed as a developer for quite some time until I realized that the reason I was scared of security was because I felt like there's a finish line, and that finish line keeps moving because security doesn't wait for you. Like if there's another thing that I'm not aware of, and someone and if I give you consent to do an audit of my cluster, then you find something that I haven't fixed. So that terrified me. But then all of a sudden, I just realized actually this is just another puzzle for me to solve. This is it can be an enjoyable experience. And I say that in a basis of because we need to do that as well. We need people like yourselves to help audit. We need to this active defense. We need to help educate others to be able to see. Right, RBACs knows like let's chat at that level. Let's talk how we do better with Kubernetes, but also let's chat workloads as well, how we can do better there. So okay, I got two questions here. Ian, I'm curious how many users you see that have a defined or documented threat model in Kubernetes. From my experience, threat modeling feels like an underrated aspect of security that's often overlooked and makes concepts like multi-tenancy and isolation carry more weight.
Yeah, some customers have very good threat models, some have absolutely none. I think is probably the way I would answer that, and that's a complete sliding scale that is useless as a metric. Um, we get a lot of customers who are running Kubernetes because they have had a vendor tell them that they only provide software in Kubernetes, so they literally do not know how it works. We also have some customers who I genuinely have had that conversation where it's a customer who said, we've been given a Helm chart, we didn't know what to do with it, so we've now got a Kubernetes cluster we need to care about. Um, the opposite end is I've seen customers who have threat modeled everything to death and have considered every attack vector before we even come in to do a job. I do think there's a lack of overall threat modeling. I think everything in security, but particularly Kubernetes, in my experience, because it's what I'm familiar with, suffers from the I know there's a bunch of edge cases that are not secure that most people won't know are problem. Um, so I, yeah, I haven't seen a huge amount of really good public resources in here's how to threat model something specifically. I think the concept of threat modeling people overcomplicate. If you're building something or if you're working with someone who's building something, just go, what's the worst that could happen if I do this? So if I've built a web endpoint, what's the worst that could happen? Oh, I accidentally expose all of my customers' PII to a simple HTTP request. And thinking about, oh, what's the worst that could happen? Customer data on the internet, how do we stop it? Is basically all threat modeling is. So it's a bunch of what are the bits I've got running? What could go wrong with it? And then, literally just go, what could possibly go wrong? And then actually answer your own question.
Mhm. And so I was gazing to my floor. My floor is also my bookshelf at this moment in time. And yeah, because I can see the book, Threat Modeling, Designing for Security. So that was the book that got me started with threat modeling. I gave a talk in Valencia about threat modeling as well, at KubeCon Valencia a number of years ago. And again, that was following COVID. And I was saying to people, if you don't if you're not aware as to what threat modeling is, you've already done it for the last couple of years. Because when we were wearing masks and we were deciding what position we wanted to be in the basis of did you isolate, wear a mask, and so forth. You were creating your own threat model. You were deciding on the factors and the information that was given to you. You came to a decision, and yeah. Anyway, I remember when I started, and I really enjoy threat modeling as well. So it's such a good tool. So yeah. Right, I've got another question. Uh, for the people who believe that namespaces are enough of a security boundary, what is an example you might use that explains why they are not enough?
I could not have asked for a better question to answer. I think this may be a plant. Thank you to whoever asked that. There's a bunch of weirdnesses in the Kubernetes role-based access control, RBAC, that are difficult to understand. So there are permissions that are available in a namespace or to certain users that allow you to do privileged actions in a cluster that people don't necessarily know are available. So the big one to me that surprised me lately is Kubernetes has a replacement to what used to be pod security policies, which is pod security admission. So it's a mechanism that says in this namespace, no workload is allowed to exist if it tries to do anything that I deem dangerous. So you're not allowed to use host resources, you're not allowed to use host networking, you're not allowed to run a privileged container. The way that's enforced is through a label on the namespace that says every resource in this namespace must run under this level. I saw lots of customers over the last couple of years who are giving RBAC star, so wildcard permissions to do anything they want, in their own namespace, but not cluster wide. So resource, they can only modify resources or interact with resources in their own namespace. And a Kubernetes namespace is not a namespace resource, it's a global resource. So this sounds secure. The thing that confused me, and then confused the Kubernetes project, I believe, when I reported this, or at least some members of the project, is that if you modify a patch request against a namespace, from inside that namespace, the request is considered namespaced, not global. So if you give star dot star inside a namespace, I can change the labels on my own namespace, at which point I can change the label that says you're not allowed to do things because of pod security admission to set it to a privilege level, um, which doesn't seem great. I think the reason for this is historically namespaces weren't viewed as a security boundary, but now they are because there are other components like network policy, like pod security admission, that rely on namespace labeling to enforce other controls. So
Mhm.
that would be the first one. The other one, very quickly in the interest of time, is the ability to install operators. So they are much more used in the OpenShift space, but there are operators for all the things all the time. I have seen operators which, when you install a namespace resource, actually install other components cluster wide that you don't realize they're installing. So they will install, you'll say, I would like one web app, please. And when you install one web app, a cluster role binding that gives everyone in the cluster admin is also created at the same time. So it's a side effect of it's a kind of confused deputy style attack where a privileged component is doing something that users don't understand. And the user can only do something in a namespace, but something else somewhere else is operating cluster wide. Those would be my
Yeah.
two. There is also a blog that I'll put a link to in the chat that we published recently. with a couple more examples of that one. And I will happily talk about this all day. So if anyone wants to talk more about that, feel free to find me on the internet.
Yeah. And I remember seeing on the internet when you shared that, and it was just like, there's Ian again. There we go. And so,
Oh, he's done it again.
yeah, he's done it again. Right. I've got one last question for you. And it's for Ivy. So our mascot, Ivy. She's on the corner of a screen right now, in a luchador outfit. So on that basis, what would your wrestling finishing move be if you were a wrestler?
I know not enough about wrestling to even begin to answer that conversation, so I'm going to cowardly dodge it.
No, I'm
Going
going to
to the
answer it
cowardly
for you
dodge.
then. I'm going
Go
to
on
answer
then.
it for you
What's my
because
finishing move?
you are one of those people that because you do lateral movement, you're not going to have you're not going to have a finishing move. You're going to do everyone else's finishing move. So whoever you're against, you're going to steal their finishing move by taking their identity by doing that, and we'll call it lateral movement. So it's a
There we
case of
go.
there. So you do the other person's finishing move, and but yeah, but not that you'd ever do that. But cool. Anyway, Ian, thank you so much for your time. So you said people can find you on the internet. They can also find you in Manchester in December, where we'll both be giving a talk at the Cloud Native Manchester meetup. Anything else? Can we find you anywhere else sort of that you would like to be found?
I am on various social medias, normally under Smarticus with a 5 on the end because someone took the username with the S on the end before I got to it. I am relatively findable. I also have a blog where I put various thoughts down. blog.iansmart.co.uk is in the chat. Do not expect any level of quality from it. It's ramblings and things I hope to remember one day.
And you can find me at Smarticus with an S on the internet. No, you can just find me. That's one of my things is there's only one Lewis Denham-Parry in the world, and at this moment in time, causes problems and solutions. But anyway, Ian, thank you ever so much for your time. And I hope everyone's enjoyed this webinar. If you do have any questions, just reach out to us. We'll keep an eye on the internet. Cool. Anyway, thanks again, Ian, and see you in Manchester next month.
See you soon. Thanks all.